Using that phrase AI, and why you talked about the overhyped nature of it all, I think of movies. There's a movie named AI, right? The boy, I think, is a robot, right? We think about robots. When we think of AI, we think of robots, and yet Tom and Wyatt spoke mostly or all about smartphones, and Patty extended that beyond smartphones. But to think that AI in the smartphone, I'm not sure the public psyche thinks of the smartphone when they think of AI or AHI, to use your phrase. They only think of all the stuff that Patty was talking about. Do you think that's accurate?
So I think you're correct, and sometimes it's helpful to remind people that AI is now all around us. It's it's being embedded in smart systems in automobiles. It is part of our consumer experience if you do any online shopping, right? For better or for worse. The kinds of things you've looked at in the past will be presented to you in a much more frequent fashion as you move forward. So those are all AI enabled. Some are fairly simple, but those are all AI enabled tools. So I think it's important for the conversation for us as a society to just recognize that these tools are all around us now.
Did you want to?
Yeah, I completely agree. And there isn't anybody in this room who isn't already deeply embedded in this world and using it for commerce, using it for information, using it for transportation. What is conspicuous is that you're not using it in healthcare very much. And we are the last ones to this party. And we have to try to figure out why that has been. It's not to say that everything that AI has done is necessarily a good thing, but one would wonder why it's been so difficult to get this very powerful approach to both collecting and understanding information, turning data into knowledge, why it has been so difficult to get that into healthcare, I think is a really big problem that we need to start thinking very seriously about how this happens in the next 3 years and not in the next 23 years.
Why is it, Patty, that we might have no problem setting up our phones to do smart pay, right? So when we're at the cash register, we buy the, we buy the food and we just we wave our phone and we're done. That's no big deal and we're already doing it. But then when we see some of the things you were talking about some of those gadgets, right? Frankly, I'll just use that phrase, that might make us more nervous. Why is that? Why do we have different reactions to these different technologies?
Yeah. Well, I mean, my reaction is one of excitement personally. I think that phones so far have had a fairly negative effect in our lives because they are so disruptive. People are not very present in their current situation because they are often somewhere else because of their phones. And while phones have given us access to the world's information and made that really convenient and easy to find any knowledge or information about anything, I think they haven't really helped us with some of these things that matter even more to be successful in life. Things like being able to pay attention, things like being able to change bad habits or support for behavior change, support for thinking more creatively, things like that. So we are in our work trying to sort of make a difference there and help people with some of this cognitive support that helps them to ultimately be more successful and accomplish their goals.
And that, just to jump off of that, because there's a bridge to cross, it seems, when we get to that acceptance. For you, Tom, a question from the audience that gets to some of this. We've seen a spike in teen suicide since the mid to late 2000s, and there is a theory out there, I don't know how well it's tested, that this might actually be connected to the increase in social smartphone use and social network platforms. How does your platform address the negative side of this digital connectivity?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's we often talk about this because the addictive component, the way in which the phones have sort of hijacked our attentional systems, and they're very good at that. They're actually way beyond good. They're outstanding at being able to grab our attention and become, I mean, how many people here have ever lost your phone for a day? And
you had to go clean the bathrooms.
That's right. Exactly. We used to do an experiment where I'd have people take out their phones, activate them, and then say, now hand it to the person next to you. And nobody wanted, you'd rather share your toothbrush than your phone at that level, because there's an enormous amount of information there. But for young people especially, this has become a massive problem, partly through the role of social media, which has left a lot of people, a lot of kids feeling disconnected. And there's some pretty good data about this, showing that if you try to measure the perceived sense of social support, it paradoxically goes down, not up, with more connectivity. So that suggests that we've got a problem. What we've been thinking a lot about Aikido. Aikido is so interesting because you take a problem, you take the punch and you go with it and you turn that into a solution. And that becomes part of the response. And so part of what we're hoping is that because there's been such a problem engaging people in care, if we can take a technology that is so engaging and turn that into a solution, that maybe there is a way to actually flip this. I do worry about the fact that this device, this technology, has potentially already created a generational issue. But if we can use that in a way that can make a generational difference, then maybe we should go there. I like the session this morning is start where people are. So let's think about that.
But it does make my brain hurt to think about if smartphones right now are part of the problem, who's this guy telling me that they're actually going to be part of the solution? You know what I mean? Like that. You asked earlier about why smartphones aren't part of the healthcare world,
Right.
and why I would throw out the hypothesis that yes, I know my financial data might be all on my smartphone, and gosh, it would really stink if I had my identity stolen, but it's a navigable problem compared to a breach of data or a breach of trust with my own personal medical records that could be used against me. And maybe that's one reason, to answer Tom's question, why we aren't in the health.
I do think it's a key both observation, Tom, and something that the healthcare sort of sector needs to face up to. And personally, I think that there's good and bad reasons. Some of the good reasons why healthcare has been sort of a laggard in this space has been that the stakes are much, much higher, right? So you're not, when you're managing somebody's health, it's not hailing a ride, and if the app only works 90% of the time and that 10% doesn't work out, oh well.
Right.
So obviously the stakes are much higher. So there's privacy issues, which are actually just in the past, obviously 6-9 months, coming to the forefront, which weren't really as prominent 4 or 5 years ago when many of these other industries were embracing this. So that's a concern. So those are good reasons to proceed with caution. I actually think the main reason healthcare is behind is because we are just haven't been agile enough in adopting new technologies to embrace solutions for our patients. I mean, and people. So I actually think that that we have to face that and say, you know what, we should look at retail and banking, and when there's an innovation out there that could help people, we should explore it, even if it's complicated and even if the stakes are higher. We should wade into those waters and start to understand it. I mean, that's what our two speakers here, have been doing so effectively. But to me, that's really important.
Let me stay with you, Wyatt, for a moment, because there's a couple questions here that get into a potential elephant in the room here. You spoke so glowingly of the ways we can bring our own care home with us, and you have the device where we're measuring our heart rate on our phone. So why are we spending all this money in Rochester to build infrastructure for expanding Mayo? And for those who aren't familiar with Mayo's story here, is that this is now called the Destination Medical Center. This is a place to be for this medical care. Why do that if we are really only a few years away from all these new technologies that make it happen
So,
at home.
so actually, great question, but I think that it's compatible because I believe that if we fast forward 5 and especially 10 years, that we could be, just thinking about the United States for a minute, we could have very sophisticated centers of excellence that I believe would hopefully include Mayo, but not be limited to Mayo, other centers of excellence that would be developing or co-developing or validating algorithms that help people manage their care. And two parts to my response. One is, it's important for us at Mayo Clinic and at every other major referral center to recognize that patients don't want to be here. Patients don't want to be here. They don't want to need to have a new heart or a new heart valve or a rare condition that isn't diagnosed yet. They actually want to be healthy and well. And so I think we have a humanitarian obligation to help solve these puzzles. However, we're all mortal and we're all going to still have medical mysteries and we're all still going to need to have complex surgeries and procedures. Maybe not as many, maybe nationally our country doesn't need as many hospital beds as we have today, but I believe we will need centers like Mayo that concentrate on excellence and solutions in significant numbers.
And Patty, if the next generation of why I talked about all the things we're doing on our phones, as did Tom, and then you again expanded past that, and you made a clear distinction between the distraction that the device has because we're looking down versus the implementation or integration into my life that some of these devices, these glasses that you wear, have. Does the smartphone become obsolete in 20 years?
I think we will still want to use the device at times to look up information, but yes, there will be other displays or other ways in which that device can interact with us other than the display itself. It may be olfactory, it may be audio, it may be heat, it may be vibration, it may be electrical stimulation, which there's lots of opportunities there as well.
Yeah.
And those are all much less disruptive than using a screen.
I gotta say, I love the idea of the rotten egg smell anytime there's food that I shouldn't eat. I liked that idea when I heard it, but there were other ideas. You talked about the earband that hears my inner speech and then looks up the answer. I'm not so sure about that. And it seems like we would almost, as a society, go through that list of things you were talking about and go yes, no, right? That just because we can develop something doesn't mean we should. And is that for the patient?
Definitely. And for that particular device, what we are currently actually looking at is applications for people with speech difficulties. We're working with some speech pathologists in looking at what some areas may be, for example, for people that have had a laryngectomy and more, that may be able to use this device. So yes, it may well be that not everybody wants to use this, but
right.
I think that there are some interesting use cases.
And one more question for you. There is this concept of the Internet of Things, right? We have devices, a lot of video games, for example, are passively hooked up to the internet with sometimes passwords that we don't even know about that are just automatically looped through. And there was actually a hack a few years ago where the Internet of Things bogged down the whole system for a few hours. If we can't secure that, how are we going to secure our personal data on one of these eyeglasses you're talking about?
I don't think it is a technical problem. I mean, that needs to be solved. It's more a problem of how we introduce this into the marketplace, what are the regulations around this and more.
How does your work, Tom, in the mental health world around these technologies also get into the stigmas of mental health in terms of, we need to have more conversations about it, et cetera, and we need to reduce the stigma of mental health and mental illness specifically. Does the smartphone address that
I
at
think
all?
it does. I don't like the term stigma because it's kind of a victim term. It's not an action term for me, but But I think there are solutions if you can provide people an anonymous system where they can access care as they need it without having to go to a clinic and announce themselves. They can do it online anonymously. They can find people providing peer support, a little bit like AA does. Think about that. AA online, what would that look like? And how would that scale and what you could provide? So I think it may not be the phone per se, but the internet, the opportunity to create community without having to necessarily go to a brick and mortar clinic, without having to sign in with your name, without having to know, having your employer or your family have to know, that's very doable. It's being done now. There are companies and there are nonprofits that are in that space, whether it's for crisis intervention or for ongoing care.
There was a statistic in one of the breakout sessions that I heard, Wyatt, about we spend $3.5 trillion a year on healthcare costs, and more than 80% of that 3.5 trillion is on chronic illnesses and chronic diagnoses.
Right.
Where does AI come in on specifically those chronic ailments?
Yeah, so I think there's a tremendous opportunity, and actually there's a lot happening. There's a number of startups that are interested in this space. There's a number of large population-based healthcare groups that are working in this, and even the care plans that I shared with you today that were developed at Mayo are really focused on common chronic conditions, which of course have heart failure is a good example. It can have an acute exacerbation, but it's something that people unfortunately have to learn to manage and live with. And so this is a tremendous opportunity for these types of techniques.
I like augmented human intelligence, actually, and I'm not just saying that because I'm on the stage with you. I see artificial intelligence as this passively intelligent thing, that this chair is just suddenly intelligent and can measure me without accounting for the fact that humans program it all. And so I see what you're going for with the phrase augmented human intelligence.
Right.
I don't know if you're going to win the battle.
No, I don't know either.
For the lexicon,
Yeah.
I don't know that we'll get that. But how does the bias in programming, and I think I'm going to go to you, Patty, for this question. When you're programming the AI, there are biases. And frankly, there are a lot of cultural biases in a largely white Silicon Valley, in a white industry that is programming all of these devices. How do you account for that?
Yeah, there's actually work in a different group at the Media Laboratory on this whole problem, and they sort of brought this problem to the forefront by showing how, for example, face detection algorithms that had been developed in Silicon Valley had a much harder time recognizing black and brown faces than white faces. So it is very important when you train these systems that you give them very representative data sets. And, so the data, getting really good data and diverse data is incredibly important.
You know, I used the example this morning, though, of the Native American community, which on most surveys, I mean, the Native American population is around 2%, less than 2%, and in different areas it's even smaller, and that shows up in many surveys as statistically insignificant. And that's millions of people that are then not part of those programs. When you're talking about adding more data, and you suddenly get all these reports in on all these data in that show an entire section of the population as statistically insignificant, what do you do?
Yeah, well, being aware of it, of the problem, is the first step, definitely. And I think while sort of initially AI people were not sort of thinking about these problems, there's a lot of efforts now on ethics and AI, and that are trying to educate and sort of come up with solutions.
I mean, what's embedded in what Patty's saying, I think it's really important and it's easy to overlook. So the nature of your question was a concern about the bias in the algorithm. The bias is actually in the data. It's in how the data feed in, and that's where you have to be inclusive. You have to make sure you've got those patients in your clinic. You've got information that's deep information about that segment of the population. Absent that, you get a training set that doesn't apply, and that's where it all breaks down. But it's not the algorithm itself that's broken. It's the data set that's got to be a much broader and more inclusive.
Did you want to add anything to that?
I did. I think one of the sort of double-edged swords of machine learning is when you develop an algorithm, you're not done. There are opportunities, if you set it up correctly, it will keep refining itself, but only on the data it has access to. So Tom and Patty's points are key. But the other is that there's the opportunity to constantly iterate and make it better and better. And just think of facial recognition, right, or voice recognition. These are, many of us experienced them when they were poor. They're now pretty good. Yeah. And think about healthcare, because what this means for Mayo or an entrepreneur that's developing a healthcare app is that if you put something out there, your work has just begun, right? You won't want to make it usable for people until it's safe and validated, but now you're going to get more data as people use it, and you're going to need to steward this. So there's going to be, and this is already happening, an enormous tail of all these algorithms out there that hopefully are doing good and providing value that then need to be stewarded, updated, tested again, and I think that jury's out on exactly how we make sure that happens.
So if I can build on that, I think Wyatt's making a really profound point, and it's easy for people to not understand this. When people ask me, what has Silicon Valley really contributed? It's not the Teslas and the hoodies and the self-driving car. It's a culture that's like this, that's iterative. It's a learning culture, feedback culture that's constantly collecting data and changing outputs based on the data. It's that closed loop that Patty talked about. That is really out of sync with the way we do healthcare. The regulated space that we've built, like the FDA space, was built around pharmaceutical development. You have a small molecule, you lock it down, you go through a 15 to 17 year process where you don't change anything about that product. We, with our products, change them every 15 hours. You're constantly improving based on the data that's coming in. And we're going to have to figure out a way, whether it's on the regulated side, the payment side, the adoption side, to help people understand that in this new era where you're working with software more than hardware, that is always getting better. Even Google's search engine, on any given moment in time, when you do a search, you're part of 150 different experiments, non-overlapping experiments, that will change the algorithms by the end of that hour, because there are billions of users every day. So that's the world we're in now. And it's not the world that healthcare is used to. We have to think through how we marry these and how we adopt a very powerful paradigm that allows for continual closed loop improvement. That's the cultural difference that I think is going to take us some time.
There's a lot more to unpack, and we are at the end of our session, but I think that's a good point to end on, so I really want to thank you. And let's thank our speakers here today, Tom Insel, Wyatt Decker, and Patty Moss. Thank you so much.